Environmental groups want to make sure you're aware of your health rights when it comes to clean drinking water. WECT's Anaya Cromartie talked with the leaders in those organizations to find out how they're trying to hold companies accountable for putting dangerous forever chemicals into the Cape Fear River.
Clean and safe drinking water is a basic human need, but for decades, chemicals and wastewater have been dumped into the Cape Fear River, polluting our water supply. However, there are ways you can make sure what's in your cup is not affected by industry polluters. If you live in the Cape Fear area, it's likely you could be one of the 500,000 residents affected by cancer-causing chemicals known as PFAS. It's used while making plastic products, but it's often released at unchecked amounts upstream in the Cape Fear River Basin.
The very end of the Cape Fear River, we're at the mercy to a lot of industry and pollution.
These chemicals don't break down in the environment, and it makes its way downstream into our tap water. Several companies test for the amounts of PFAS, and while the levels are remaining the same, Clean Cape Fear pushes for standards and lasting protections against how companies dispose of waste.
It's time to get legally enforceable levels so that we can hold polluters accountable.
And there is something companies can do right now.
There is technology that can remove these chemicals from their wastewater. There's product substitution. There's ways to keep all of the pollution on site.
Environmental groups ask that as a community, we push these companies to find solutions.
Just to make sure that everybody's working together to solve this problem, that we are all a united voice in protecting water quality in our region.
Clean Cape Fear says they believe change will come through new laws. They encourage people to call on local county commissioners, state representatives, and members of Congress to protect the federal drinking water standards. Anaya Cromartie, WECT News.